you everybody for attending this. I hope you're going to get a lot out of it. It's certainly a passion of mine to talk about it. And over the many years internationally that I've been supervising students in different continents, many of them have used grounded theory successfully, particularly to get their doctorates. So there's a lot to get through. It's not an easy approach or methodology to talk about in 40 minutes. So I'm going to have to rattle on and try and cut out all the sort of surplus talk that I usually do around the slides. So I'm going to keep fairly religiously to the slides in order to get through the material in the time. So I've got two aims. To talk about the theoretical and methodological underpinnings of grounded theory. I'm going to call it GT from now on. And I actually have always said to my students, don't call it a methodology because it's more than that. It's actually an approach, which you'll come to see. Secondly, second aim is to describe the stages that would constitute research design if you're a postgrad using GT. And helpfully, I'm going to cite one of my most successful students who adopted GT. She was a Hong Kong PhD student, and she won Best International Prize for her doctorate. So hopefully that example will help you understand. So first aim, remember, was theoretical and methodological underpinnings of GT. So I'm going to examine what is grounded theory, when is it appropriate to use GT, and what are the key differences between three GT designs. And then we'll come to the methodological assumptions that GT makes. So the first thing is I tear my hair out, frankly, in frustration when I see students claiming that they've used grounded theory, when what they really mean is they've used empirical data. They've gone out into the field and they've collected empirical data, primary data, and they think that's grounded theory. Well, it isn't. It's nothing to do with grounded theory. So don't fall into that trap. Second thing is GT is a very structured set of systematic and analytical methodological processes, and it generates a theory. And that distinguishes it from most other qualitative approaches. So in my opinion, over many decades of using this with my students, PhD students, I regard this, and I go to the cross on this one, as the most rigorous of all qualitative methods. Nothing comes close to the rigor of GT in the qualitative domain of research. The third feature GT that's worth explaining is it's extremely conceptual, and therefore a good language ability is very helpful for students if you're going to use GT. And finally, a point that I've touched on already, really, GT is very developed. It's a systematic procedures, a systematic set of procedures for collecting data, analyzing it, identifying categories or themes, exploring the connections between these categories and themes, and then generating a theory. And of course, that means it's absolutely ideal for PhDs or for doctoral research, because all universities, Glasgow especially being a good one, one of the key aims of you doing requirements for you doing a PhD is to contribute in some way to theory. You'll recognize that, all of you who are doctoral students, that's an absolute essential. And so grounded theory, GT, is ideal for making a contribution to theory. So this is when we look at when is it appropriate to adopt GT, many of you might be well on in your PhD studies, so it may be too late to adopt a full-on GT approach. But these are the conditions that I believe are ideal for anybody starting out designing their research for PhD. The first thing is it's absolutely wonderful for analyzing complex interactive situations in organizational settings like schools or universities, such organizational settings, any educational setting. So it would, for example, typically look at how teachers cope with difficult, troublesome students, for example, or how teachers manage their careers, or how school principals manage their teachers. So it's very, very ideal for analyzing interactive situations in complex organizational settings. Secondly, it's absolutely perfect where no pre-existing theories exist to explain a problem that you want to investigate. And so what you can do is you can't appeal to any already existing theories, but what you can do for your doctorate is produce or formulate a new theory. You can generate your own theory where none previously exists. And I have to say, how many of us over the years have searched in vain for pre-existing theories and had to make do, compromise, because there aren't any pre-existing theories on our exact context. You might find there's a theory that's applied to American education, but not to Asian education systems. So GT is a wonderful opportunity to create a new theory where no existing theory exists. It's fantastic too for producing, this is me down to it, I love typologies. I love classifying teachers, students, principals, administrators into types. So this is a wonderful methodology for doing that, approach for doing that. It's very rigorous, as I've said. It applies very systematic procedures. And so that's why I'm quite defensive and protective in knocking down people who claim to have used GT but actually haven't, because they haven't adopted systematic procedures. It's ideal too for very in-depth detail of processes. The amount of in-depth detail is tremendous that you can go into. And also, it's ideal when large amounts of qualitative data are to be handled, because you can accommodate that data by abstracting and conceptualizing. And then when theorizing is necessary, the main purpose, as I've said, is to build a theory. So you could build a theory around a group of teachers, a group of students, a group of principals. So it can come down to an organization, a department in a school. You can build a theory of a substantive theory on that scale. You can't use GT to study one person. You can't build a theory around one person. You do need a number of people in your sample, because you wouldn't have a typology. If you had just one person, you wouldn't have a typology. So the researcher has to ask, what is the research problem that I'm really interested in, that I want to understand? What are the aims and purposes of my study? And what are my research questions? Now, none of that will surprise you. I think that's common to, if your supervisor is doing their job with you, you'll have gone through those processes if you've started your PhD already. And then by addressing those three questions, you begin to form some idea of the research design that you want to take shape in order to accommodate and address those questions. In every case, the grounded theory that you generate will only apply to the sample that you choose. So you'll generate a theory, let's say, of maths teachers in school X, but that's all. You can't claim that that theory is going to apply to necessarily to English teachers in school X or to other maths teachers in other schools. Your GT is very targeted at your sample. However, as I say in the next point, if you've detailed the contexts very carefully, and you should do in your doctoral postgraduate studies, this will enable the readers to say, oh, well, this group of maths teachers in school X is very similar to my situation in school Y, and therefore I might be able to transfer and apply some of the theory to my own situation. So it's not right to say there is no transferability at all. It depends very much on how well the context to the theory is described so that others can understand whether they can apply it or not. But I do point out to you in passing that the purpose of GT is not to generalize. So the examiner who sits there examining you at your doctoral viva, who says, but you can't generalize from this because your theory applies to this school or that school. Well, the examiner doesn't understand the purpose of GT. It's never to generalize. And you'll see why and what it can do as I go through. So there are, just very briefly, there are three types of GT designs. I'm going to jump to the second one first because historically, what I call the emerging design came first with a guy called Glaser and his partner Strauss in the 1960s. And they adopted an anthropological approach so that research questions weren't formed near the beginning of the study, but they only emerged later on as they gathered data in the field. So it was very open, very loose. And for obvious reasons, if you're doing a doctorate, this emergent design is not really appropriate because you've only got a limited time doing a doctorate. And you can't say, I spent 2 years in the field understanding what the problem is before I did my research questions. So the systematic design of Strauss and Corbin, number one, is the most structured and is the one that I've used with students mostly because it conforms to the usual parameters of university administration. They want to know what your research questions are. They want to know the research design early on. And so you can get collecting data as soon as possible. So, but then that's been the number one approach, systematic design, has been complemented now by since the early 2000s with the constructivist design. These number one and number three are not alternatives. They can be meshed together. And the constructivist design sort of says the researcher joins the whole interpretation process with the participants, and together there's interaction in creating meaning. And this is in line, as you can understand, with a constructivist approach. Now, so the old-fashioned view of the researcher being detached and objective from the participant giving information is now right way out of, it's obsolete. And most researchers now admit that it's actually quite good for the researcher to be very involved with the participants in making judgments and interpretations. So, what are the methodological assumptions to GT? It's obviously falls within the interpretivist paradigm. You will know what that is. I won't go into that. But very interestingly and importantly, and it's really affected my whole approach to research over many decades. It assumes that reality is subjective, like interpretivism does, and it's formed from the experienced life of individuals and groups within the community. And the underlying theory that backs that up, that I've always been keen for my students to use, is what's called symbolic interactionism, which is extremely reputable as a philosophical approach. And it was in symbolic interactionism was attributed originally to George Herbert Mead and to one of his disciples, Henry Bloomer, who both come from the Chicago School of Philosophy and Sociology. And the basic tenet of this, of symbolic interactionism, is that human beings act on the basis of meanings that they form through interaction with others in social situations. So the people, it starts off, I guess, with early family life. It might include school, peers and teachers, church, if you're religious, the people you mix with at university. All the time we're interacting with others. And these interactions help us in interpreting and explaining what's going on in our lives. And that's basically, in a very crude way, the meaning of symbolic interactionism. I love it. I've encouraged my students to adopt it, and it goes well very comfortably with GT. So it's a philosophical underpinning to grounded theory. So how do you go about my second aim now, designing and implementing a research study? Well, using the structured approach of Strauss and Corbin, that number one approach of the three, this will be music to your ears. You identify a research problem, what are your research aims and research questions. So that's very typical of other research approaches and methods. Where do you find research problems? In all sorts of situations, from practice to books, journals, and conversations with colleagues. Once your research problem's decided, the aim is to conceptualize it. So you have to put it in academic conceptual language. And after conceptualization of the problems, you decide the aims, which in GT's case is to develop a substantive theory to explain the central phenomenon at the heart of the problem. And from the aims, you then get your main research questions and specific research questions. And then typical GT research questions are usually framed in action or process terms. So it would be a typical GT research question would be, how does X manage or cope with problem Y? That's so that's how you couch your research questions. So I'm going to give you an example. I thought it would be very helpful for me to stop talking about in the abstract terms and talk about an actual example. This was a Hong Kong student. I used to teach in Hong Kong University, and this student actually was the one who won the best international prize for her doctorate. And she identified the research problem, which was the dearth of women in senior academic positions in Hong Kong universities. This was done about 15 years ago, by the way, now, so it may have changed since then, But at the time, when she looked around the 8 universities in Hong Kong, there were amazingly few senior women academics. And by senior, she meant professors, deans, and upwards, pro vice chancellors, and there were no VCs, needless to say. I don't think there may have been one VC, pro VC, but there were some professors and a few deans. But it was a field dominated by men, basically. And that was her research problem. And she came to me and she said, I want to adopt a feminist approach. Well, I said, well, hang on a minute. We know what the feminist approach is going to come up with. Male chauvinism, blah, blah, blah. That's not going to really tell us very much. It's not going to improve the knowledge base. How is it going to help us to just re-examine all the old arguments about male chauvinism, male domination, male aggression, and so on? So I said, why don't you adopt a life history and career experience? I said, can you identify the few successful women who are at the top in Hong Kong universities? And I said, if you can identify, let's say, at least 10, you can develop a substantive theory of how these senior women actually made it to the top positions. And then I said, that would be tremendously helpful because we can see what we can learn from those women who've broken the male barrier. And that's a lot better than just adopting a feminist critical perspective. So she bought into this, and I'm so pleased she did because it paid off dividends. So her main research question was, what in the life histories of senior female academics in Hong Kong has contributed to their career success? In other words, she wanted to examine these life histories of these women academics and see what she could draw out of them that would help others follow similar paths, maybe. So the specific research questions are there, all 6 of them. I won't go through them because it saved time. But normally about 5 or 6 specific research questions, they break down the main research question, which is the general question, but it's not researchable in that form. You need more specific research questions to make it researchable. And these were the 6 that she came up with about their childhood, life events, experiences, what roles they played, any mentors who'd helped them, and so on. So that's the example from her. Now, with the good thing about the Strauss and Corbin systematic approach to GT is that it allows you to do the lit review early on, which is fairly typical of if you're doing a PhD at Glasgow, you would probably be doing that early on, lit review, getting familiar with what's been published and so on. And then that also, as you go through the literature, that helps you conceptualize the problem and possible models or frameworks for understanding what's going on, the processes, the people involved, and so on. And all that is early research steps in helping you eventually come up with how to collect data and analyze it. So now here's a typical example. She came back to me, my student, and said, oh, Clive, she said, I can't find any literature at all on women academic careers in Hong Kong. Well, I said, well, that doesn't surprise me because it's so specific. And you're doing, as participants in this session, you may have found this with your PhD or doctoral experience, that there's nothing exactly on your topic. So what you do is you start looking around for research literature that's closest to it. So she started looking at gender gap in HE staff internationally. Internationally, we know males dominate the deanships and and the pro-vice chancellors and so on. She started looking at general literature on career aspirations of female academics, not necessarily related to Hong Kong and not necessarily related to senior female academics. Then what could she find on successful careers of women in general? Business, politics, anything. And then any necessary attitudes and skills that might be associated with female career success. So she was having to find relevant literature from elsewhere that she could possibly learn from. And then the data collection process involves, and this won't be new to you, the good thing about GT is it uses all the standard 3 qualitative methods of data collection. There's nothing unique about GT in its data collection. They apply to across the whole qualitative domains. Interviewing, usually semi-structured. Observations, I think that should be used more. In my extensive experience, I wish students would use observation more. And documentary sources. So all 3 are very common, not just to GT, but to all qualitative methods. And it's always good to use more than one of those for triangulation and to strengthen trustworthiness. And where do you get your interview questions from? You align them with your specific research questions. So there's tight alignment. Now we begin to come to the data collection and analysis. And it's particularly in the analysis that GT differs from other qualitative approaches and methods. So with GT, you collect a bit of data and then you analyze it straight away. It's simultaneous. So you don't go on collecting data, and then when you've finished, you start the analysis process. No, it's simultaneous because you can change and modify your research questions based on your previous round of analysis. So you become more targeted with each round of interviews and data collection. That's a very important strength of GT, that you can change and modify your research questions as you go through. And you keep going in most GT situations of collecting data, coming back, analyzing it, until you're learning no more from an extra interview or data collection. We call that data saturation. There's no point keep interviewing more and more people and analyzing them because you're getting the same things. We call that data saturation. So the Hong Kong example, my student started biographical search of participants. She used websites, university websites, newspapers, media to find out more about participants. She then started semi-structured interviews with two lots of 2-hour slots each. Email conversations took place, and at each stage, data analysis began and alternated with the collection. To help with the interviews, she used an aide memoir. And in the aide memoir, which is the guide, the interview guide, these are the sorts of issues that she came up with to guide her when she was interviewing and talking. I mean, interviews are more conversations, aren't they? They're with this sort of approach, qualitative approach, they're not interrogations, they're much more conversations, particularly given constructivist approaches to GT nowadays, where the researcher is very much helping the participants interpret and make sense of the data. So all these I'll leave you to go through at leisure if you're interested. Now we come to a critical point, sampling, because again, a couple of things drive. There's two types of sampling that GT uses: purposive and theoretical. Now, what many doctoral students don't realize is that purposive is 15 different types of purposive sampling. And I've just included some here, few here, that are most commonly used. Maximum variation sampling is the most used, and I encourage my students to use that. What it does is it looks deliberately for maximum difference among the participants. So you might only have 10 or 15 in your sample, but you're looking for maximum differences between those 10 or 15. And that allows you to claim you can't generalize, but what you can say is this is the range of people doing this phenomenon. Another criterion is another second type that's often used in conjunction is criterion sampling. So in this case of my student, the criterion was you had to be a woman and you had to be in a senior academic position. So these were the two of the three main sampling methods my student used. She used maximum variation because she wanted these women to be from different disciplines like science, social science, arts, humanities. But she used criterion because they needed to conform to being senior academics. But you can have typical case sampling, you can have atypical case sampling, snowball or chain sampling, where you ask somebody you're interviewing, can they recommend someone else who has a different view from them? So that one's often used. And theoretical sampling is used in GT, where you deliberately choose people who can enrich and saturate your data. So you're covering all the possibilities of it sort of accompanies maximum variation sampling because you want to develop your theory. So it's important that you choose and sample people who can maximize and develop your theory as it's emerging. So occasionally you may be forced to use opportunity and convenience sampling. These are also two types of purposive sampling, by the way, but they are the weakest because you may be teaching a class and you're going to use that class that you're teaching as your sample. Well, that's opportunity and it's convenient, but it's not necessarily a rigorous form of sampling. So I call these the weak forms of purposive sampling. Don't forget, there's 15 types. Don't just say I adopted purposive sampling because there's 15 types. So the key feature of GT is it's comprehensive, it's in depth, it's fine grained. Sample sizes, particularly for postgrads, would be between 10 and 25. You can't form typologies unless you have a certain minimum number. And as I say here, my student adopted criterion sampling as one of the sampling methods because she needed women to be holding senior academic positions. So she came up with 11 senior female academics in her doctoral research. She writes memos, field notes, and diagrams. As she's going through analyzing the data from each one, she's writing memos to herself, which may inform her subsequent data collection. And she's drawing diagrams to try and make sense of the data as she's analyzing it at each step of the way. Now, we come to the key differences between GT and other qualitative methods. This first stage of data analysis is open coding, And this is no different from, I'm seemingly contradicting myself. It's identical to good other qualitative methods. If you're using qualitative methods, you'll almost certainly be open coding. And the process is, as you know, you code. A code is a concept label. You get hundreds of them. You form them into clusters to form categories, and you compare the codes with each category, and you decide which category to put codes in. And eventually, after hundreds of codes and putting them into their categories, you develop these categories to include properties and dimensions. And that's what probably all of you, if you're doing qualitative methods, you will be expected to do. So GT has this in common with other qualitative methods. So here's an example taken from my student. The transcript's on the left, and she's forming these codes on the right-hand margins. So she's going to form hundreds of these as she goes through the transcripts. And then she's going to write memos to herself, what these codes are raising in her mind about, these are women. Did they all go to girls' school? She's found that the first one she interviewed went to an all-girls school. So she's raising questions. I need to find out from subsequent interviews whether these other senior academic women also went to all-girls schools. Do they have a view on males? Have they come across male chauvinism in their career paths and so on? So she's just raising these questions in her mind as she's analyzing the data. Now we come to two further stages of analysis that are very much different, GT, from other qualitative approaches.
Sorry, Clive, we've got about 8 minutes. So just to
Okay,
give you an idea.
thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Paul. Yeah, so I'm going to be fairly quick. So axial coding is looking at the relationships between the categories. The codes have gone into categories. Now you're beginning to look for the relationships between the categories. And it's very good in step 3 to use particular paradigm. The one that I encourage students to use is, what is the central phenomenon, the central problem and issue? What is the causal conditions of it? What are the strategies or actions or practices that people adopt in handling or managing, coping with the problem? What are the specific context conditions, and what are the outcomes or consequences that arise? So these are very, very specific to GT. So you're trying to look at the relationships between the categories in terms of the causal conditions, the strategies and actions that were taken, the contexts, and the consequences and outcomes. So these are the sorts of examples of the phenomenon and the properties and dimensions that she came up with as an example. So she became a Christian. She associates becoming a Christian with a lot of her career success. It gives her a sense of mission, a sense of what she likes and dislikes, a sense of strength, because God, she regards, is going to be with her through her journey. And then she recognizes from the data that some of these are long and strong. These are dimensions. They give a measurement to these properties. So she's breaking down the categories according to properties and dimensions. And then these are the actions and consequences, the outcomes. Again, I'll leave you to come to look through that. Then we come to the final bit of coding called selective coding, which is the most important. It only occurs in GT, not with other qualitative methods. This is the actual core category that absorbs all the categories. So we're actually stepping up from coding to categories, relationships between categories to selective coding. And this is going to form the theory. So in her case, her core category, she decides, is the dominant attributes of women. They all have success attributes in common. And when she looked at these 11 women, they all were intelligent, they had high energy levels, they were committed, they persevered, and so on. All those were common. But she also found that they had preferred and different strength attributes. So these attributes were honed and refined through their socialization. Remember, George Herbert Mead, the symbolic interactionism, says we create meaning in our lives through interaction with others. And this was certainly the case, she argued here. And she came up with a typology of 3 types of academics. These 11 women fell into one of 3 types. One group were women who were very strong attributes in research and investigation. They were purely strong, research-orientated people. A second group of the 11 could be identified as much more interested in education and teaching, and student-orientated. They loved teaching, they loved their students, and they saw their roles very much as humanitarian, helping others. And then a third group of the 11 that she recognized was they had a dominant set of attributes that were thrived on challenges, taking opportunities when they arose, and they were quite sort of determined to get up the ladder, to be ambitious in their careers. So she labeled these 3 types: researchers, teachers, and managers. So the 11, if you took the 11, let's say four of them were researchers, 3 of them were teachers, and 4 of them were managers. This is the typology. So with the typology, she then explains the career strategies. So type 1, she identified from the data what these characteristics for type 1 were. They focused on essential tasks, etc. Type 2, they focused on time management, thinking positively, responding to the needs of students. Type 3, they were much more politically astute. They were much more risk-taking and taking opportunities and so on when they arose. So the outcome, I'm nearly finishing now, was a grounded theory, a typology, and some propositions. So she studies usually you'd study between 10 and 20 participants, no more, because you'd have too much data otherwise. So 10 to 20, she studied 11, my student. She came up with 3 typologies. She then identified through the data how each type had similar attributes and characteristics that you could track back through the data, and she comes up with a typology. And then I'm just finishing now. So the outcome, sorry to rush through this, she had a theory that explained the career success of women academics in Hong Kong. She calls it the theory of selective attribution in career trajectory. She has a storyline describing how they all had some commonality of attributes, but they also emphasized differently 3 different sets of attributes that accounts for their 3 separate career paths, how they built their career success according to whether they were strong researchers, strong teachers, or strong risk takers and opportunists. And that basically turns out to be the theory. I won't. The last couple of slides uh, are what I've already explained. Really, the typology is career academics, career educators, career opportunists, and lastly, she does, like you would all have to do, make sure your study meets the criteria of trustworthiness in qualitative research. We don't call it validity and reliability, but I've always encouraged my students to use Lincoln and Guber's set of trustworthiness criteria, the four things like triangulation of data and member checking